Talk. Naples, 1850 to 1851. It would be amusing, if the misfortunes of mankind ever could be so, to hear the pretensions of the government here, Naples, to mildness and clemency, because it does not put men to death, and confines itself to leaving 6 or 7,000 state prisoners to perish in dungeons. I am ready to believe that the King of Naples is naturally mild and kindly, but he is afraid, and the worst of all tyrannies is the tyranny of cowards. Tocqueville, 1850. In the autumn of 1850, with the object of benefiting the eyesight of one of their daughters, the Gladstones made a journey to southern Italy, and an eventful journey it proved. For Italy it was that now first drew Mr. Gladstone by the native ardor of his humanity, unconsciously and involuntarily, into that great European stream of liberalism which was destined to carry him so far. Two deep principles, sentiments, aspirations, forces, call them what we will, awoke the huge uprisings that shook Europe in 1848, the principle of liberty, the sentiment of nationality. Mr. Gladstone, slowly and almost blindly heaving off his shoulders the weight of old conservative tradition, did not at first go beyond liberty, with all that ordered liberty conveys. Nationality penetrated later, and then indeed it penetrated to the heart's core. He went to Naples with no purposes of political propagandism, and his prepossessions were at that time pretty strongly in favor of established governments, either at Naples or anywhere else. The case had doubtless been opened to him by Panizzi, a man as Mr. Gladstone described him, of warm, large, and free nature, an accomplished man of letters, and a victim of political persecution, who came to this country a nearly starving refugee. But Panizzi had certainly made no great revolutionist of him. His opinions, as he told Lord Aberdeen, were the involuntary and unexpected result of his sojourn. He had nothing to do with the subterranean forces at work in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, in the states of the Church, and in truth all over the peninsula. The protracted struggle that had begun after the establishment of Austrian domination in the peninsula in 1815, and was at last to end in the construction of an Italian kingdom, the most wonderful political transformation of the century, seemed after the fatal crisis of Novara, 1849, further than ever from a close. Now was the morrow of the vast failures and disenchantments of 1848. Jesuits and absolutists were once more masters, and reaction again alternated with conspiracy, risings, desperate Carbonari plots. Mazzini, 4 years older than Mr. Gladstone, and Cavour, a year his junior, were directing in widely different ways, the one the revolutionary movement of Young Italy, the other the constitutional movement of the Italian resurrection. The scene presented brutal repression on the one hand, on the other a chaos of republicans and monarchists, Unitarians and Federalists, frenzied idealists and sedate economists, wild ultras and men of the sober middle course. In the midst was the Pope, the august shadow, not long before the center, now once again the foe, of his countrymen's aspirations after freedom and a purer glimpse of the lights of the sun. The evolution of this extraordinary historic drama, to which passion, genius, hope, contrivance, stratagem, and force contributed alike the highest and the lowest elements in human nature in the growth of states, was to be one of the most sincere of Mr. Gladstone's interests for the rest of his life. Spectacle of misrule. As we shall see, he was at first and he long remained untouched by the idea of Italian unity and Italy a nation. He met some 30 or more Italian gentlemen in society at Naples, of whom 7 or 8 only were in any sense liberals, and not one of them a republican. It was now that he made the acquaintance of Lacaita, afterwards so valued a friend of his, and so well known in many circles in England for his geniality, cultivation, and enlightenment. He was the legal advisor to the British Embassy. He met Mr. Gladstone constantly. They talked politics and literature day and night, under the acacias and palms, between the fountains and statues of the Villa Real, looking now to the sea, now to the world of fashion in the Corso. Here Lacaita first opened the traveler's eyes to the condition of things, though he was able to say with literal truth that not a single statement of fact was made upon Lacaita's credit. Mr. Gladstone saw Bourbon absolutism no longer in the decorous hues of conventional diplomacy, but as the black and execrable thing it really was, the negation of God erected into a system of government. Sitting in court for long hours during the trial of Porio, he listened with as much patience as he could command to the principal crown witness, giving such evidence that the 10th part of what he heard should not only have ended the case, but secured condign punishment for perjury, evidence that a prostitute court found good enough to justify the infliction on Porio, not long before a minister of the crown, of the dreadful penalty of 24 years in irons. Mr. Gladstone accurately informed himself of the condition of those who for unproved political offences were in thousands undergoing degrading and murderous penalties. He contrived to visit some of the Neapolitan prisons, another name for the extreme of filth and horror. He saw political prisoners, and political prisoners included a large percentage of the liberal opposition, chained 2 and 2 in double irons to common felons. He conversed with Porio himself in the Bagno of Nisida chained in this way. He watched sick prisoners, men almost with death in their faces, toiling upstairs to see the doctors, because the lower regions were too foul and loathsome to allow it to be expected that professional men would enter. Even these inhuman and revolting scenes stirred him less, as it was right they should, than the corruptions of the tribunals, the vindictive treatment for long periods of time of uncondemned and untried men, and all the other proceedings of the government, desolating entire classes upon which the life and growth of the nation depend, undermining the foundation of all civil rule. It was this violation of all law, and of the Constitution to which King Ferdinand had solemnly sworn fidelity only a year or two before, that outraged him more than even rigorous sentences and barbarous prison practice. Even on the severity of these sentences, he wrote, I would not endeavor to fix attention so much as to draw it off from the great fact of illegality, which seems to me to be the foundation of the Neapolitan system. Illegality, the fountainhead of cruelty and baseness and every other vice. Illegality, which gives a bad conscience, creates fears, those fears lead to tyranny, that tyranny begets resentment, that resentment creates true causes of fear where they were not before, and thus fear is quickened and enhanced, the original vice multiplies itself with fearful speed, and the old crime engenders a necessity for new. 241. Porio apprehended that his own case had been made worse by the intervention of Mr. Temple, the British minister and brother of Lord Palmerston, not in the least as blaming him or considering it officious. He adopted the motto, to suffer is to do, il patire ancho operar. For himself he was not only willing, he rejoiced, to play the martyr's part. I was particularly desirous, wrote Mr. Gladstone in a private memorandum, to have Porio's opinion on the expediency of making some effort in England to draw general attention to these horrors, and dissociate the Conservative party from all suppositions of winking at them, because I had had from a sensible man one strong opinion against such a course. I said to him that in my view only 2 models could be thought of, the first, amicable remonstrance through the cabinets, the second, public notoriety and shame. That had Lord Aberdeen been in power the first might have been practicable, but that with Lord Palmerston it would not, because of his position relatively to the other cabinets. Yes, he said, Lord Palmerston was isolato, not because he would be wanting in the will. Matters standing thus, I saw no way open but that of exposure, and might that possibly exasperate the Neapolitan government, and increase their severity? His reply was, as to us, never mind, we can hardly be worse than we are. But think of our country, for which we are most willing to be sacrificed. Exposure will do it good. The present government of Naples rely on the English Conservative Party. Consequently we were all in horror when Lord Stanley last year carried his motion in the House of Lords. Let there be a voice from that party showing that whatever government be in power in England, no support will be given to such proceedings as these. It will do much to break them down. It will also strengthen the hands of a better and less obdurate class about the court. Even there all are not alike. I know it from observation. These ministers are the extremest of extremes. There are others who would willingly see more moderate means adopted. On such grounds as these, I do not quote words, he strongly recommended me to act. 2. Return to London. Mr. Gladstone reached London on February 26. Phillimore met him at the station with Lord Stanley's letter, of which we shall hear in the next chapter, pressing him to enter the government. "I was never more struck," says Phillimore, "by the earnestness and simplicity of his character. He could speak of nothing so readily as the horrors of the Neapolitan government, of which I verily believe he thought nearly as much as the prospect of his own accession to one of the highest offices of state. He probably thought not only nearly as much, but infinitely more of those scenes fitter for hell than earth, now many hundred miles away, but still vividly burning in the haunted chambers of his wrath and pity." After rapidly dispatching the proposal to join the new cabinet, after making the best he could of the poignant anxieties that were stirred in him by the unmistakable signs of the approaching secession of Hope and Manning, he sought Lord Aberdeen, March 4, and found him as always, satisfactory, kind, just, moderate, humane, to Mrs. Gladstone, March 4. He had come to London with the intention of obtaining, if possible, Aberdeen's intervention, in preference to any other mode of proceeding, 242, and they agreed that private representation and remonstrance should be tried in the first instance, as less likely than public action by Mr. Gladstone in Parliament, to rouse international jealousy abroad, or to turn the odious tragedy into the narrow channels of party at home. Mr. Gladstone, at Lord Aberdeen's desire, was to submit a statement of the case for his consideration and judgment. Position of Lord Aberdeen. This statement, the first memorable letter to Lord Aberdeen, was ready at the beginning of April. The old minister gave it mature consideration for the best part of a month. His antecedents made him cautious. Mr. Gladstone, 10 years later, admitted that Lord Aberdeen's views of Italy did not harmonize with what was his general mode of estimating human action and the world's affairs, and there was a reason for this in his past career. In very early youth he had been called upon to deal with the gigantic questions that laid their mighty weight upon European statesmen at the fall of Napoleon. The natural effect of this close contact with the vast and formidable problems of 1814-5 was to make him regard the state system then founded as a structure on which only reckless or criminal unwisdom would dare to lay a finger. The fierce storms of 1848 were not calculated to loosen this fixed idea, or to dispose him to any new views of either the relations of Austria to Italy, or of the uncounted mischiefs to the peninsula of which those relations were the nourishing and maintaining cause. In a debate in the Lords 2 years before, July 20, 1849, Lord Aberdeen had sharply criticized the British government of the day for doing the very thing officially, which Mr. Gladstone was now bringing moral compulsion on him to attempt unofficially. Lord Palmerston had called attention at Vienna to the crying evils of the government of Naples, and had boldly said that it was little wonder if men groaning for long years under such grievances and seeing no hope of redress, should take up any scheme, however wild, that held out any chance of relief. This and other proceedings indicating unfriendliness to the King of Naples and a veiled sympathy with rebellion shocked Aberdeen as much as Lamartine's trenchant saying that the treaties of Vienna were a feat. In attacking Palmerston's foreign policy again in 1850, he protested that we had deeply injured Austria and had represented her operations in Italy in a completely false light. In his speech in the Pacifico debate, he had referred to the Neapolitan government without approval but in guarded phrases, and had urged as against Lord Palmerston that the less they admired Neapolitan institutions and usages, the more careful ought they to be not to impair the application of the sacred principles that govern and harmonize the intercourse between states, from which you never can depart without producing mischiefs 1,000-fold greater than any promised advantage. Aberdeen was too upright and deeply humane a man to resist the dreadful evidence that was now forced upon him. Still, that evidence plainly shook down his own case of a few months earlier, and this cannot have been pleasing. He felt the truth and the enormity of the indictment laid before him. He saw the prejudice that would inevitably be done to conservatism both at home and on the European continent, by the publication of such an indictment from the lips of such a pleader, and he perceived from Mr. Gladstone's demeanor that the decorous plausibilities of diplomacy would no more hold him back from resolute exposure than they would put out the fires of Vesuvius or Etna. On May 2 Lord Aberdeen wrote to Schwarzenberg at Vienna, saying that for 40 years he had been connected with the Austrian government, and taken a warm interest in the fortunes of the empire, that Mr. Gladstone, one of the most distinguished members of the cabinet of Peel, had been so shocked by what he saw at Naples, that he was resolved to make some public appeal, That to avoid the pain and scandal of a conservative statesman taking such a course, would not His Highness use his powerful influence to get done at Naples all that could reasonably be desired? The Austrian minister replied several weeks after, June 30th. If he had been invited, he said, officially to interfere he would have declined. As it was, he would bring Mr. Gladstone's statements to the notice of His Sicilian Majesty. Meanwhile, at great length, he reminded Lord Aberdeen that a political offender may be the worst of all offenders, and argued that the rigor exercised by England herself in the Ionian Islands, in Ceylon, in respect of Irishmen, and in the recent case of Ernest Jones, showed how careful she should be in taking up abroad the cause of bad men posing as martyrs in the holy cause of liberty. During all these weeks, while Aberdeen was maturely considering, and while Prince Schwarzenberg was making his secretaries hunt up recriminatory cases against England, Mr. Gladstone was growing impatient. Lord Aberdeen begged him to give the Austrian minister a little more time. It was nearly 4 months since Mr. Gladstone landed at Dover, and every day he thought of Porio, Settembrini, and the rest, wearing their double chains, subsisting on their foul soup, degraded by forced companionship with criminals, cut off from the light of heaven, and festering in their dungeons. The facts that escaped from him in private conversation seemed to him, so he tells Lacaita, to spread like wildfire from man to man, exciting the liveliest interest, and extending to the highest persons in the land. He waited a fortnight more, then at the beginning of July he launched his thunderbolt, publishing his letter to Lord Aberdeen, followed by a second explanation and enlargement a fortnight later, 243, he did not obtain formal leave from Lord Aberdeen for the publication, but from their conversation took it for granted. Neapolitan letters published. The sensation was profound, and not in England only. The letters were translated into various tongues and had a large circulation. The Society of the Friends of Italy in London, the disciples of Mazzini, and a high-hearted band they were, besought him to become a member. Exiles wrote him letters of gratitude and hope, with all the moving accent of revolutionary illusion. Italian women composed fervid odes in fire and tears to the Generoso Britanno, the Magnanimo Signor, the Difensor d'un Popolo Gementi. The press in this country took the matter up with the warmth that might have been expected. The character and the politics of the accuser added invincible force to his accusations, and for the first time in his life Mr. Gladstone found himself vehemently applauded in liberal prints. Even the contemporary excitement of English public feeling against the Roman Catholic Church fed the flame. It was pointed out that the King of Naples was the bosom friend of the Pope, and that the infernal system described by Mr. Gladstone was that which the Roman clergy regarded as normal and complete. 244. Mr. Gladstone had denounced as one of the most detestable books he ever read a certain catechism used in the Neapolitan schools. Why then, cried the Times, does he omit all comment on the Church which is the main and direct agent in this atrocious instruction? The clergy had either basely accepted from the government doctrines that they were bound to abhor, or else these doctrines were their own. And so things glided easily round to Dr. Cullen and the Irish education question. This line was none the less natural from the fact that the editor of the Universe, the chief Catholic organ in France, made himself the foremost champion of the Neapolitan policy. The letters delighted the Paris Reds. They regarded their own epithets as insipid by comparison with the ferocious adjectives of the English conservative. On the other hand, an English gentleman was blackballed at one of the fashionable clubs in Paris for no better reason than that he bore the name of Gladstone. For European conservatives read the letters with disgust and apprehension. People like Madame de Lieven pronounced Mr. Gladstone the dupe of men less honest than himself, and declared that he had injured the good cause and discredited his own fame, besides doing Lord Aberdeen the wrong of setting his name at the head of a detestable libel. The illustrious Guizot wrote Mr. Gladstone a long letter expressing, with much courtesy and kindness, his regret at the publication. Nothing is left in Italy, said Guizot, between the terrors of governments attacked in their very existence and the fury of the beaten revolutionists with hopes more alert than ever for destruction and chaos. The King of Naples on one side, Mazzini on the other, such, said Guizot, is Italy. Between the King of Naples and Mazzini, he for one did not hesitate. This was Mr. Gladstone's first contact with the European party of order in the middle of the century. Guizot was a great man, but 48 had perverted his generalizing intellect, and everywhere his jaundiced vision perceived in progress a struggle for life and death with the revolutionary spirit, blind, chimerical, insatiate, impracticable. He avowed his own failure when he was at the head of the French government, to induce the rulers of Italy to make reforms, and now the answer of Schwarzenberg to Lord Aberdeen, as well as the official communications from Naples, showed that like Guizot's French policy the Austrian remedy was moonshine. Perhaps discomposed by the reproaches of reactionary friends abroad, Lord Aberdeen thought he had some reason to complain of the publication. It is not easy to see why. Mr. Gladstone from the first insisted that if private remonstrance did not work without illusion or delay, he would make a public appeal. In transmitting the first letter, he described in very specific terms his idea that a short time would suffice to show whether the private method could be relied upon. 245. The attitude of the minister at Vienna, of Fortunato at Naples, and of Castelcicala in London, discovered even to Aberdeen himself how little reasonable hope there was of anything being done. Illusion and delay was all that he could expect. He was forced to give entire credit to Mr. Gladstone's horrible story, and was as far as possible from thinking it a detestable libel. He never denied the foundation of the case, or the actual state of the abominable facts. Schwarzenberg never consented to comply with his wishes even when writing before the publication. How then could Aberdeen expect that Mr. Gladstone should abandon the set and avowed purpose with which he had come flaming in resolve to England? Sensation in Europe. It was exactly because the party with which Mr. Gladstone was allied had made itself the supporter of established governments throughout Europe, that in his eyes that party became specially responsible for not passing by in silence any course of conduct, even in a foreign country, flagrantly at variance with right. 246, and what was there, when at last they arrived, in Prince Schwarzenberg's idle dissertations and recriminations, winding up with a still more idle sentence about bringing the charges under the notice of the Neapolitan government, that should induce Mr. Gladstone to abandon his purpose? He had something else to think of than the scandal to the reactionaries of Europe. I wish it were in your power, he writes to Lacaita in May, to assure any of those directly interested, in my name, that I am not unfaithful to them, and will use every means in my power. Feeble they are, and I lament it, but God is strong and is just and good, and the issue is in his hands. That is what he was thinking of. When he talked of the sacred purposes of humanity, it was not artificial claptrap and a protocol. 247. When I consider, Mr. Gladstone wrote to Lord Aberdeen, that Prince Schwarzenberg really knew the state of things at Naples well enough independently of me, and then ask myself why did he wait 7 weeks before acknowledging a letter relating to the intense sufferings of human beings which were going on day by day and hour by hour, while his people were concocting all that trash about Frost and Ernest Jones and O'Brien, I cannot say that I think the spirit of the letter was creditable to him, or very promising as regards these people. The Neapolitan government entered the field with a formal reply point by point, and Mr. Gladstone met them with a point-by-point rejoinder. The matter did not rest there. Soon after his arrival at home, he had had some conversation with John Russell, Palmerston, and other members of the government. They were much interested and not at all incredulous. Lord Palmerston's brother kept him too well informed about the state of things there for him to be skeptical. Gladstone and Molesworth, wrote Palmerston, say that they were wrong last year in their attacks on my foreign policy, but they did not know the truth. 248. Lord Palmerston directed copies of Mr. Gladstone's letters to be sent to the British representatives in all the courts of Europe, with instructions to give a copy to each government. The Neapolitan envoy in London in his turn requested him also to send 15 copies of the pamphlet that had been got up on the other side. Palmerston promptly, and in his most characteristic style, vindicated Mr. Gladstone against the charges of overstatement and hostile intention, warned the Neapolitan government of the violent revolution that long-continued and widespread injustice would assuredly bring upon them, hoped that they might have set to work to correct the manifold and grave abuses to which their attention had been drawn, and flatly refused to have anything to do with an official pamphlet consisting of a flimsy tissue of bare assertions and reckless denials, mixed up with coarse ribaldry and commonplace abuse. This was the kind of thing that gave to Lord Palmerston the best of his power over the people of England. Energetic sympathy of Palmerston. In the House of Commons he spoke with no less warmth. Though he had not felt it his duty, he said, to make representations at Naples on a matter relating to internal affairs, he thought Mr. Gladstone had done himself great honor. Instead of seeking amusements, diving into volcanoes and exploring excavated cities, he had visited prisons, descended into dungeons, examined cases of the victims of illegality and injustice, and had then sought to rouse the public opinion of Europe. It was because he concurred in this opinion that he had circulated the pamphlet, in the hope that the European courts might use their influence. 249, as Lord Aberdeen told Madame de Lieven, Mr. Gladstone's pamphlet, by the extraordinary sensation it had created among men of all parties, had given a great practical triumph to Palmerston and the Foreign Office. The immediate effect of Mr. Gladstone's appeal was an aggravation of prison rigor. Panizzi was convinced that the king did not know of all the iniquities exposed by Mr. Gladstone. At the close of 1851 he obtained an interview with Ferdinand, and for 20 minutes spoke of Porio, Settembrini, and the condition of the prisons. The king suddenly cut short the interview, saying, "Addio, terribile Panizzi." 250, faint streaks of light from the outside world pierced the gloom of the dungeons. As time went on, a lady contrived to smuggle in a few pages of Mr. Gladstone's first letter, and in 1854 the martyrs heard vaguely of the action of Cavour. But it was not until 1859 that the tyrant, fearing the cry of horror that would go up in Europe if Porio should die in chains, or worse than death, should go mad, commuted prison to perpetual exile. 251, and 66 of them were embarked for America. At Lisbon they were transferred to an American ship, the captain, either intimidated or bribed, put in at Queenstown. In setting foot on this free soil, Porio wrote to Mr. Gladstone from the Irish haven, March 12, 1859, "The first need of my heart was to seek news of you." Communications were speedily opened. The Italians made their way to Bristol, where they were received with sympathy and applause by the population. The deliverance of their country was close at hand. Not now, nor for many years to come, did Mr. Gladstone grasp the idea of Italian unity. It was impossible for him to ignore, but he did undoubtedly set aside, the fact that every shade and section of Italian liberalism, from Farini on the right to Mazzini on the furthest left, insisted on treating Italy as a political integer, and placed the independence of Italy and the expulsion of Austria from Italian soil as the first and fundamental article in the creed of reform. Like most of the English friends of the Italian cause at this time, except the small but earnest group who rallied round the powerful moral genius of Mazzini, he thought only of local freedom and local reforms. "The purely abstract idea of Italian nationality," said Mr. Gladstone at this time, "makes little impression and finds limited sympathy among ourselves. I am certain," he wrote to Panizzi, June 21, 1851, "that the Italian habit of preaching unity and nationality in preference to showing grievances produces a revulsion here, for if there are two things on earth that John Bull hates, they are an abstract proposition and the Pope. You need not be afraid, I think," he told Lord Aberdeen, December 1, 1851, "of Mazanism from me, still less of Kossuithism, which means the other plus imposture, Lord Palmerston, and his nationalities." But then in 1854 Menin came to England, and failed to persuade even Lord Palmerston that the unity of Italy was the only clue to her freedom. 252, the Russian war made it inconvenient to quarrel with Austria about Italy. With Mr. Gladstone he made more way. 7 to breakfast to meet Menin, says the diary, he too is wild. Not too wild, however, to work conversion on his host. "It was my privilege," Mr. Gladstone afterwards wrote, "to welcome Menin in London in 1854, when I had long been anxious for reform in Italy, and it was from him that, In common with some other Englishmen, I had my first lessons upon Italian unity as the indispensable basis of all effectual reform under the peculiar circumstances of that country. 253, yet the page of Dante holds the lesson. 3. The temporal power. On one important element in the complex Italian case at this time, Mr. Gladstone gained a clear view.